Hello and welcome to the Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. And I understand there was some excitement, and so we hopefully will keep the theme of excitement going. My name is Rana Sarkar. I'm the Consul General of Canada and your moderator for today.
Which is kind of a big deal for me, so thank you for that.
It's like Canada. We're going to explain why that is of particular interest for tonight. The club would like to thank, first of all, the Bernard Osher Foundation for supporting this Good Lit event. And before we get started, there'll be a few reminders here. This program is recorded, so we kindly ask you to silence your phones for the duration of this program. And also, if you have any questions for Ali, please fill them out on cards that were on your seat. And for those joining on YouTube, please leave them in the chat. Now it's my particular pleasure to introduce my old friend Ali Velshi, who is an award-winning journalist and MSNBC host. Many of you know him from your screens over the last 30 years. He's an immersive, on-the-ground reporter who previously was an anchor, a correspondent, and he is everywhere, not just with MSNBC, but prior with Al Jazeera and CNN. Ali was born in Nairobi. He was raised in Toronto, critical fact. And his new book, The Small Acts of Courage, A Legacy of Endurance and the Fight for Democracy, traces his family's courageous journey from freedom to freedom, starting in India, then to South Africa, where they escaped apartheid, and later emigrating to Kenya and ultimately moving to Canada and the United States. Ali, welcome.
Thank you.
And so the longer piece of this, and the reason why I'm doing this, you just ask, why is a Canadian Consul General interviewing Ali Velshi on this stage? Is because Ali and I go back, about 38 years, I think, by my calculation. And we are a kind of a species of people who emerged on Canadian shores in the 1970s. And 1980s, and you see sort of resonance in the United States of this species of people as well, which is the broader, a particular generation of people who draw their lineage back to the Indian subcontinent. And this story that Ali tells in this book, and it's part memoir, obviously, sort of going through his remarkable family history, but it also touches on sort of many of the thematics that most of us care about over the course of the last century, which have been, how has democracy evolved? What have been the fights for individual rights and collective and group rights within pluralistic societies? And how can we keep those pluralistic societies together? And, you might ask, so we were at university together, and Ali was somebody who, is as you see him. And you wonder, how does a 20-year-old come out this well-formed? How does a 20-year-old come out with this set of ideas and this set of desires for change? And the reason is this remarkable backstory. And so maybe we can start with that remarkable backstory, Ali.
Thank you, my friend. Yeah, I couldn't believe my good fortune that I had asked the Consul General for his address to which I could send a book, and he texted back and he said, "Is there anything we can, can I do anything to be helpful?" And in that moment I thought, well, yeah, actually, you've lived a lot of this story. So why don't we have a little conversation about the two of us talking about it together, as opposed to sort of a traditional interview. So thank you. It means a lot, and I bet you this audience is going to get something different out of this than other rooms I've spoken to, because you can prod things that you know the other side of. So I appreciate that. My family started, like a lot of people in the Indian diaspora, leaving India in the 1800s. Mine left at the end of the 1800s, but the 1800s was a period of remarkable economic upheaval in India, largely because it was actually, these were climate refugees. It was mostly because of drought in India, and my family fell victim to that. Now, in a big country, in theory, when you have a number of climate issues, and this is very relevant to today, you should be able to mitigate them in some fashion. It's becoming harder and harder to do so. But the thing about India was that the India that was taken over, that was colonized by the British, was a massively important country. It was almost a quarter of global GDP at the time that the colonialists took over. By the time colonization ended in India in 1948, it was down to about 2% of GDP. So the country had been denuded of its ability to be resilient in the face of these droughts, and people left by the millions. Now, if you're in India, you went where the boats took you, and they weren't, generally speaking, coming here. Some were, but most weren't. They were going to either farther east into Asia or Africa or the West Indies. And so my family ended up in South Africa, where compared to being in drought-stricken Gujarat, it was the promised land. It was the streets were paved with gold. They came from a colony which was racist and unfair, but remember that in India there were very few British officials at the height of the British Raj. It was generally run at home. So the average Indian was not getting a fair shake economically, but they weren't feeling the generally speaking, the daily brunt of racism that you got in South Africa. South Africa was a whole nother kettle of fish. So my family were merchants. I thought that meant they were business people. They were literally merchants who were selling things from wheelbarrows and small carts, vegetables or whatever the case is. But that led to them having small shops. And as their shops got a little more prosperous, my great-grandfather needed an accountant. So he found this Gujarati bookkeeper. Mm-hmm. The Gujarati bookkeeper had another Gujarati client whose name was Gandhi. And he introduced them. And the two became friends. Gandhi lived in Johannesburg. My great-grandfather lived in Pretoria, where the government was. So Gandhi would have to, with his constant agitations and the negotiations with the government, he'd constantly have to come to Pretoria. My great-grandfather would give him a place to stay, because in those days in South Africa, Indians, non-white people couldn't stay at hotels or anything like that. And he would give him use of his horse and cart to go back and forth to his meetings. And so one night they're sitting like we are. They've become friends. And Gandhi says to my great-grandfather, the Indians in this country do not have the courage and the backbone to fight the injustices. So I'm going to start an ashram, a commune, to give them the strength to do that. And I would love your son, that's my future grandfather, who was 7 years old at the time, I would love your son to come be my student. And my great-grandfather looks at Gandhi and thinks this is a terrible idea because he's a businessman. Why does he want to get involved with this agitator? So he says to Gandhi the only thing that comes to mind, and that is that we're Muslims, you're Hindu. I can't send my son to your school. He's got to learn his religion. To which Gandhi says, I will read your Quran and I will teach him your religion. Which he did. And that was not unusual for Gandhi. He had read Hindu scripture, he had read Christian scripture, and of course he understood Hindu scripture very well. So that was, first of all, Gandhi was a pluralist at the time and was, becoming a much more worldly guy by the week. But my grandfather became his youngest student at the age of 7 on this ashram, where they had they fundamentally grew up as Hindus, so they had no meat, but they also had no hot water and no beds. They slept on the floor. They gave him 2 blankets. You slept on one, and you had one to cover you.
This was a precursor for, a training for how, you would endure conditions in prison.
In fact, prison sounds like it might have been better. But that was exactly the point, that folks needed to toughen up. And in order to fight injustice, you needed to have the courage to understand that you would get arrested. And the result, by the way, they would often offer a chance to pay a monetary fine, but the design was to turn the fine down and take the jail time. And then to leave after your 30 days in jail, because these were essentially misdemeanors, and go right back to where you committed the so-called crime, which was going in the wrong door of the bus station or the train station, and get arrested again and fill the prisons to get the media attention onto the story of racism.
But you also raise in those chapters of your book this idea that Gandhi was not at that stage, the Gandhi, the Richard Attenborough sort of biography of Gandhi that we know now. He was somebody who was asking for a set of very prescribed rights within a British colonial system.
Within the system. He saw Indians as citizens within the British colonial system, and he did not think that as citizens, Indians were being afforded their rights. He did not at the time think his design was not to undo the British colonial system. I don't know whether he would have liked to, or he just thought that's too big a fight, but he didn't want to do that, nor did he think everybody had equal rights. He was arguably a racist. His views and his writings about black Africans at the time, I'm not going to arguably, they were actually racist things that he said. He just wanted the Indian to be closer up in rank to the British. And he had been educated in the UK.
But that was the early Gandhi you
Early
speak of,
Gandhi.
yeah.
Early Gandhi.
And
he then evolved in South Africa. And Gandhi often said, I was born in India, but I was made in South Africa. He took the lessons of South Africa, took them back to India, and succeeded remarkably in India. But yeah, the early Gandhi was not who we have come to know. And that's a great story of evolution, that people evolve. He subsequently understood that until everybody has justice and equality and liberty, we cannot count any of ourselves as having those things.
And which is quite illustrative in so many ways, and of course, I was just, we were speaking earlier about I just read the Jonathan Eig great biography of King, and
an important read. People should.
And absolutely, and the amount of inspiration that King took in the early civil rights movement from Gandhi, of course, and it was a great struggle. This issue of, do we work within the system or do we work to, overthrow the system?
Right.
And which was the crux of the 1960s, within the civil rights movement, the battle within the civil rights movement. And but your family, from, you obviously your great grandfather comes over from India. And there was a great story about jumping into shark-infested waters. So all immigration, by the way, is not always, sort of as prescribed. Sometimes there are slight detours, and this one took a detour into shark-infested water.
It was interesting because it was right around the time of the end of the Boer War, and there was no internet, and for poor people, there was no phoning either. So my great-grandfather, on his journey back to South Africa, wasn't clear on who had won the war. And this played out differently. If he pulled into a South African port and the Afrikaners had won the war, he is now coming in as an Indian British subject. He's now the enemy. And all this dream of coming to South Africa to create a new life would end at the end of that gangplank at the border. If the British had won the war, it would be fine. He would be a British citizen. But he didn't know what had happened, so he figured it would be better to not take the boat all the way to South Africa, but as soon as he saw land, which was at the time Portuguese East Africa, Mozambique, he jumped off into the shark-infested waters and swam to shore, where he ended up in Portuguese East Africa, in which he could go through the jungle into going into South Africa without crossing at a border. And so he didn't know what he would have saved him a lot of trouble if he had realized the British had won the Boer War. But
that's the importance of news.
And of course, Rana's question to me is, do you know? Because my fascinating thing is that I didn't know anybody in my family could swim, and he was wondering whether that's still the case.
But these are small acts of courage. I mean,
that was a bit big.
The other threat
with the sharks. Let me tell you that I'm not getting to that. But immigrating is tough.
Yeah.
Right. I think we have to remember that as the conversation about immigration in this country gets tainted the way it has. It is important to remember that whether you think about it as a economic imperative, or you think about it as a charitable imperative, which you really shouldn't, because that's not useful. It is hard to make the decision, no matter how much better America might be for you than wherever it is you're coming from. It is a hard decision to make. These people were not multilingual in many cases. They were not educated in any formal way. And they didn't know what lay on the other side. There would be a letter that would have come back from somebody who had gone to South Africa to said everything's fantastic and here's some money. So they're sending money back thinking it must be good. He's got enough money. He's got more money to send back than we are earning here. But those are decisions that everybody in this country has made, or their parents have made, or their grandparents have made. And it's important to honor the fact that that is no small decision. And because of these big decisions that people make to come to these countries, our countries benefit as a result. They literally benefit from the addition of these people because we don't have enough children to populate our own societies.
So we're in South Africa in the 1910s through 1930s and 40s. And of course, apartheid doesn't officially become a thing until 1947 or so. But prior to that, there was a settlement in South Africa where, it was already extremely racially divided. There was a coming of age of sorts of a movement in South Africa during that period, and your family is quite involved in that as well.
And at the time, there were different movements. The Asians were involved in a particular movement. The Africans had a movement, and it wasn't clear that in many cases, and this happened across Africa, there were many black Africans who believed they needed to do this without the Asians. At one point in the movie Gandhi, you see Gandhi telling his white architect best friend or a preacher who was a white man, I need to do this without you.
Yeah.
So these were interesting times. But what happened is the black Africans had the numbers to be effective in trying to fight what was going to become apartheid. The Asians had more money. So a number of smart people in both communities said, why don't we combine? Because these Asian demonstrations were always very small. And because they were a moneyed group of people, they didn't see themselves as demonstrators and didn't want to get involved and thought it would wreck their businesses. But they did feel that these laws were unjust and they would like to support the overturning of them. So that's how it came together. And they came together in other ways too, because there were not many non-whites who were trained to be lawyers or doctors or things like that. But South Africa effectively trained a few of them so that they could say to the world that they actually have a black lawyer here. He's right here. So there were some black lawyers, and there were a few more Indian lawyers. There were a good number of South African white Jewish lawyers who played a very, very big part in the anti-apartheid movements. But these coalitions started to come together and work together to overcome apartheid. Ironically, the response from the government from the 1910s all the way to when apartheid became a real thing in 1947 was just to be more and more harsh. At no point did anybody gain any meaningful concessions. It only got worse as the years went on. And to some people's surprise, in 1947, in the national elections of 1947, remember 1948 is when India won its independence under Gandhi, and has a spinning wheel on the flag, because that is what Gandhi said. Your self-sufficiency will be the way you gain independence. In that very same year, apartheid laws were coming in that prescribed everything. I mean, first it was you can't marry somebody who's not the same color that you are. Then it was you can't have any sexual relations with them, and how everybody lived and the ways in which they divided people into race. So it was interesting to see. Gandhi left South Africa in 1913-14 thinking he had failed, and went on to great success in India. But
your grandfather and his brothers stayed.
They stayed, and things got better for them as business people, but worse for them as Indians, as people of color. And ultimately, by the early 1960s, it all came together, and it was just ultimately worse.
Yeah. And after South Africa, you speak in the book about how your family had a very successful bakery business, a commercial bakery business, and 4,000 loaves of bread a day?
An hour.
An hour. Jeez.
Yeah.
A lot of bread.
It's a lot of bread.
And so you have all this, this big industrial concern at that stage.
Yep.
And then, of course, your grandfather and your grandfather's brother were quite involved with movement.
Yeah.
And, the state then steps in and, does what the state does, the apartheid state, and it makes it very uncomfortable for them.
Yeah, they basically make it impossible for them to do business, because at 4,000 loaves of bread an hour, this is not a corner bakery. This is a bakery that packs all of its bread into trucks. The trucks then go into every areas were all race restricted, right? So went into a particular area in which wholesalers would then take the bread, get it to bakeries, because everybody bought their bread in the morning. And initially, they were allowed to do their business like any other bakery, but they were the only non-white bakery in the country. And so in exchange for, to penalize my family for supporting financially anti-apartheid stuff, for bailing people out of jail, all of their workers who would get arrested. It was routine to get arrested if you were black in South Africa. Literally, the crime was being black and walking around. But the interesting thing about being black, if you got arrested, there was a fine. so in the case of my grandfather was 5 pounds or 30 days in jail. With black workers, it was 5 pounds or you work on a farm. So it was free labor, just like the American South, the equivalent of chain gangs. So every Monday, my grandfather and my father would be at court getting these guys out of jail who did nothing. So this is just an example of the Byzantine things that happened in apartheid South Africa. They started telling my family, you can't have a standing permit. You'll have to get it renewed 2 times a year. And then it became 4 times a year and monthly. And then it became weekly. You have to get your permit to go to distribute the bread renewed weekly, which meant Mondays were a write-off because you're going to a government office to get a permit done, so you can't clearly be inside the place you have to sell your bread before 6 a.m. And then it became daily. So in fact, at that point, I mean, you can't. By the time you got your permit, the permit office opens at 9. All bread is sold by 7 a.m. I mean, in that culture, people bought their bread fresh. And that's it. So that put them out of business. So my dad tried to, they created a bread war. They tried to take a few businesses down on the way out, and they did. They succeeded in taking four bakeries out, bankrupting them, at which point the government had it. And my dad and my grandfather were together on the day in 1961 where they bulldozed the ovens, which were the central part of the bakery. And my dad says it was the only time he had seen his father cry. My grandfather was 58 years old, and he died a week later. But here's the good part about the book. He died thinking, this is the man who was on Gandhi's farm, he died thinking he had failed in his efforts, fully. He saw his bakery come down. This is the business that they had built that they used to finance the anti-apartheid struggle. What he didn't know is that his son, as you and I know, because we got to witness it, his son would become the first South Asian Muslim elected to major office in Canada. His daughter-in-law would run for office. His granddaughter would run for office, and his grandson, who looks a lot like him, would be me. Wouldn't have known that would have happened.
We spent a lot of time in South Africa, and the reason why I really wanted to get into this part of the story is that for audiences nowadays, and for anyone reading nowadays, the mundanity and the kind of the complexity of the law. This is the law of the land. This is the state using coercive power, in very unjust ways, and the complexity of it, and the kind of moral compliances that sort of went on, and the moral compromises that went on, is, I think, illustrative. It's interesting to get back into those details, and again, I think that was a very useful component of what you put forward here.
Yeah, I wanted to both position the memoir in history, and as somebody said the other day, "Wow, your family's like Forrest Gump. You keep running into these sort of moments in history." But actually, everybody's family runs into moments in history, right? You exist when things happen, and you remember where you are, and that's what it was. My family was just being my family. It just happened to have been influenced by major shifts. So when my family actually left South Africa, it was a sensible time for them to have left South Africa, given that they had extinguished their ability to fight the power. They got to Kenya, which was at the time another center of the Indian diaspora, but at the time a British colony. My parents were in Kenya, where I was born, when the British flag came down and the Kenyan flag went up. People who couldn't vote by virtue of the color of their skin were there for the birth of a democracy, which was amazing to them. And one of the things I talk about in the book is the degree to which our house in Toronto growing up, which you spent much time in, had Kenyan decorations. Because even though my family was fundamentally Indian, we'd been out of India for a long time, and they had spent more of their life and the more influential part of their life in South Africa. In South Africa, you couldn't have anybody else's art. It was proscribed. White people's music and art was theirs, and black people's music and art was theirs, and there was this in-between, colored people, mixed race people. They had their own way of talking and their own foods, and Indians had their own, and amongst Asians there was divisions between Indians and Chinese. So yeah, it was a completely prescribed environment, which you can imagine why that motivates me into the world that I'm in right now, this world of pluralism, right? We grew up grabbing at anything we could grab at to not be stuck into our own little ghettos.
And Kenya, that early experiment with Kenyatta and onwards also becomes, politically complicated for particularly South Asians.
And understandably. Understandably, black people had not been given the agency to govern their lands across Africa for a very, very long time. And one of the and in Kenya, I truly believe they wanted it to be a pluralistic, multicultural society. One thing you have to understand about African countries is they're by definition multicultural, right? It's not just a mass of black people. They are people with different languages, different lineages, different ethnic lineages. And Kenya had a lot of that. And so they meant it to be a pluralistic, multicultural place. But there were these pressures on Asians. Some of them were self-imposed. Some of them were not, though, because while the colonizers controlled everything, and the goods went to Britain to be produced, for the black person who was not enjoying the fruits of their labor or success or the good feelings of democracy, when they went into town, they didn't see the British colonizer. They saw the Indian shopkeeper. They saw the Indian accountant. They saw the Indian lawyer. They saw the Indian doctor. The Indian was occupying the space above the black person. And what the Indians and the black people should have been doing is fighting together to eliminate the yoke of control. But these societies work very well in causing people to be mad at each other, which again, full circle, very instructive about America today, right? We are really good at causing people to fight with each other about things that we should be fighting together. But that's what a colonial power did. So for Indians, it became tough, particularly what was going on in Uganda with Idi Amin. There was a real sense of, we're coming for you. And I don't think that was broadly shared amongst Africans in East Africa, but it was there enough to worry my parents, who had already lost so much in that first effort to try and fight for a fair democracy, that the fear of losing it a second time.
And you get some good advice from Canadian diplomats and others to...
There's always a Canadian diplomat
in the story, lurking in the background.
There literally is.
I kid you not. The only reason I'm standing on the stage right now is my dad ran into a Canadian diplomat in Osaka during the World's Fair. And he, was asked, all right, well, I was going to Australia, and I'm going to come to Canada instead because, there's this new thing going on in Canada. Pierre Trudeau had just come to power.
Yep.
And that story of running into, somebody who says, your path is about to change.
Yes.
And, there is this new opportunity. And in your parents' instance, it took them a while. It took some convincing what a
world, right? Where the diplomat's convincing people.
I know, exactly. This never happens, by the way.
This diplomat made them come to his office to fill out the forms, and basically said to my parents, if you get your rights to go to Canada and you don't want them, then don't take them. But please, can we just do this? Can we fill out these forms because you may not be safe here.
Yeah. And
so they did. They filled out these forms and they went to Canada. And there was, what had happened in Canada at the time was that Pierre Trudeau and Lester Pearson, who was the prime minister at the time, Pierre Trudeau would subsequently become the prime minister. I mean, they just did basic math. This wasn't a particularly sophisticated approach. They looked and said, our birth rates are slowing. We don't have enough workforce here, and we are competing, generally speaking, with the United Kingdom and America for immigrants. So we're going to have to get awfully creative about this. And that meant two things. Getting creative was looking at different layers of people who you might want to come to your country. And that included activists and refugees, which most countries will take, but they'd rather not, right? You'd rather not take the activist, because just take the quiet people who work. That was number one. And number two was, what model do you create to make Canada into a place that these people who were otherwise looking at other places would choose to come to? And the model was that you can, and you I'm sure can articulate this better than I can, but it was a model that said, you can come here and will feel under no pressure to lose your culture, your underlying culture. And we will sort of trick you into liking ours as well. And you will be able to hold both. And I have to say, I truly believe in my heart that is how it's unfolded in Canada.
Well, I mean, I think in Canada it also rests on 500 years of prior history. of peoples, including indigenous peoples, sort of coming together and recognizing that we are not in the majority here. All of us are, going to have to do some give and take. And
they did welcome us.
And they did welcome other people. But I think that there was also something else that was taking place. And this is a reality that you're seeing not just in the, Anglosphere and Anglo-American worlds, but everywhere in the so-called Western world. During that period was this idea that the racialization of citizenship and the racialization of who could come to the country was, by the mid-1960s, late 50s, early 60s, was starting to dissipate. And you're saying for some very practical reasons, but also some moral reasons. There's also a broader movement. And I think that the Pearson-Trudeau sort of connection in Canada deserves an enormous amount of credit for that, but also some of their predecessors in the Diefenbaker government, which was a conservative government in Canada. They actually started the policy of looking at some of these, the way in which racial immigration was taking place. But equally in the United States, at that same time, you started to see a change in the immigration law. And part of the reason why the United States looks like it does today is, the start of that approach.
Yep.
But in Canada, it was a remarkable place. When your parents arrive, in the early 1970s in Canada, and unlike a lot of new immigrants to Canada, they arrived in a part of Toronto that was not particularly diverse at the time.
Correct.
And in some ways, that was a very good thing for your family. I wonder if we wanted to.
Yeah, it's interesting.
That.
My parents, until just a couple of years ago, lived in the very same house that Rana knows very well and that we grew up in. It was 42.
It's probably now destroyed for a monster.
It is
house,
there was a very big house
yeah.
on that piece of land now, and I. Owning a piece of property in Toronto seems very compelling these days. So I've thought about it. And it was, but at the time, there was little bungalows. They were mostly lived in by veterans of the Second World War. So what I write about in Canada is I didn't think it was a very diverse street, but it was very diverse by Canadian standards because it had Irish, Scottish, and English on the same block. And they took those differences very seriously.
They did.
And then we had some Irish who were Protestant, some Irish who were Catholic. The whole thing was very crazy. But there were two people on the street who were a little bit different from even that. They were not from the British Isles. And it was my buddy Mikey and me. Mike's family was half Sicilian and a quarter Syrian and a quarter French Canadian. And we were Indian, which made us brothers on the street. Like they all just, he doesn't look anything like me. He's a pretty white guy. But we were definitely not like everybody else on the street. But Toronto was a more multicultural city than the block I lived on, but we didn't experience that. So the schools that I went to, I was definitely the standout. But it influenced me, it confused me a little bit, because I didn't get to grow up sort of inside my identity, although the house, my grandmother wore a sari and spoke Gujarati, and we ate Indian food, and we had Kenyan decorations, and my grandmother decided that she really liked Christmas lights, because she thought that was an excellent thing, so we had Christmas lights when we had Christmas lights, and we had a Christmas tree. So the whole thing was confusing in the best way.
Yeah. But so what's remarkable about Ali's family, and I want you to say something about the particular traditions of the Ismaili community, and for those of you who are who haven't come across this, is that the Ismaili community in particular, in the context of the broader diaspora of people of Indian origin that moved out, had some very interesting ethics that were very effective in building community, building a sense of contribution, and a sense of organization and agency amongst people. And I want to say something about
so we're members of the Ismaili Muslim community. It's a minority amongst minorities in the Islamic world, seen by some as heretical, actually. But it has an ethos, it has a few important ethos. One is of pluralism. The idea that we must not think of others in terms of tolerance. Tolerance is the wrong approach. Tolerance suggests there's something fundamentally wrong with you that I have to put up with. Pluralism means we're different. Well, we have different foods and different religions and different ethnicities and different backgrounds, different socioeconomic status, different politics, and yet we are together in this project that is a country. We share the land. We share responsibility for one another. The other one is of volunteerism. It is a highly structured community in which all the positions are held voluntarily, both the lay and the religious positions, and in a fairly institutionalized and structured way. And these positions are held, they are either gender balanced or rotated in a way that makes sure women and men are all playing equal roles in the leadership of the community. And so it worked, interestingly enough, very well in South Africa, where the government didn't want to take care of anyone. So it was the Ismailis could take care of themselves by having social services, childcare, educational services, healthcare services, things like that. What has happened since is the body of the Ismaili community that provides those services has expanded into newspapers, hospitals, universities, that serve everybody in the community as part of that pluralistic ethos. Ismaili hospitals and universities are not for, and banks are not for Ismailis. They're for everybody in the community. And what that did is when my parents got to Canada, they were so hungry to be involved in politics. They also came from a community where the building blocks for getting you involved in civil society exist. And so the transition into being all these various things, holding these positions you've held within the community into holding it in the broader community becomes very easy. You know, you've met a lot of Ismailis, they could have easily become city councilors.
Absolutely.
Right? Because they were busy doing that stuff inside the community. So there was an ethos of service within the community. There was an ethos of, with my family in particular, of wanting to be involved in civil society because they couldn't do that because of the color of their skin now in 2 countries. So they really wanted to get down to this thing. And so 10 years into being in Canada, my parents got there in 1971. By 1981, they were ready to jump in. They wanted as much as society could give them and that they could give to society.
And you were, and your family was quite central to what I think is an amazing thing in many ways. We are looking at the way in which politics, elected politics, in places like Canada, where we have, dozens of now minority origin MPs, including many people, including cabinet ministers.
Looks like the bar from Star Wars.
I know. Well, no. It's
in a good way.
It's representative.
Yeah, it is. It's amazing.
It is representative, yeah. And it's also, but it stands on an edifice of early contributors. And your father, when he ran for office in 1981, and which, of course, he was going up against a juggernaut at the time, somebody who was extremely well loved and, a lovely individual who's the institutional candidate, and he was the oppositional candidate. Yet
Yep.
they formed a relationship as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether politics was just different then, or Canada was different then, or Canada's still like that now. But our experiences in elected politics in Canada were not adversarial in that way. They were adversarial on the debate stage, which is where they should be adversarial, because back then there were real all candidates meetings where the candidates would stand up and they would be questioned by the audience about particular policy stances, and it wasn't an adversarial thing. It doesn't mean that people didn't boo or clap. They did. They had strong positions on a lot of strong issues, but there were policy discussions. Yeah. And the irony is that I was 11 years old when my dad ran, and he announced in that living room of that house that he was going to run, and everybody thought that was crazy, saying things like, I don't think it works that way, or I don't think that's I don't think we're ready, or whatever the case is. And my dad said, we're not going to know until we try. So why don't we try? So he runs for office, and I'm the youngest person on the campaign, and I'm very, very excited by the whole thing, and I think we're going to win. Can I read a little passage on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It was. So it's election night, and we've been campaigning, and we would run into this guy. Dennis Timbrell was the guy my dad was running against. Dennis Timbrell was a conservative, and he was the Minister of Health, which in a country in which healthcare is as important as it is in Canada, being the Minister of Health is akin to being the Attorney General or the Treasury Secretary or something like that. It's a very big, important job. So this is who my dad's running against in a constituency that had been conservative for 42 years at that point. There was nothing about that that signaled victory. So on election day, after at 6:30 or so, rush hour slowed to a trickle. My dad said he wanted to go back to the house and change into the suit he was going to wear to watch the election returns come in at our campaign headquarters that night. So while everyone else went back to the office to eat and wait for the returns, I rode home with my dad. After he changed and got his speeches ready, we left our house to return to headquarters just before the polls closed at 8. As we were driving, my father flicked on the radio right at 8 p.m., right as the station launched into the top of the next hour, which opened with news of the evening's election results. The polls have closed across Ontario, the announcer says, and it's too early to tell who will form the government tonight. He then continued, but there is one race we can call. We can declare Dennis Timbrell the victor in the riding of Don Mills, Toronto. I couldn't believe it. It was literally 8:01. Over 100 races have been run across the province that day, and my father had just suffered the biggest, swiftest, most resounding loss out of all of them. I didn't understand how they could have known who won right after the polls had closed, how they could have counted the votes already. I assumed it would take hours for the election to be called. I didn't understand anything about exit polling and projections or any of that, but they were able to call it based on nothing more than the fact that Dennis Timbrell was the safest incumbent anywhere in the entire province. His victory was as inevitable and as obvious as the nose on my face. I was shocked. I glanced up at my father, expecting him to be confused and angry as well. But the look on his face betrayed nothing but ease and contentment, which confused me further. I can't believe we lost, I said. Of course we lost, he said with the biggest smile. We were never going to win. What? I said. What do you mean we were never going to win? What was this all about? We ran because we could, he said. I stood for what I believed in. People had a chance to vote for me, and more people voted for the other guy than voted for me. That was always going to happen. I knew that, but I ran. And now I've lost. Our life goes on. We don't get arrested. We don't get shunned. Nothing bad happens. Wow. It blew my mind. For the whole campaign, little 11-year-old me had been looking up to my dad, seeing him on stage, doing the debates, and thinking it was the coolest thing in the world, not understanding politics at all. I'd honestly believed that we were doing it because we had a shot at it. It was going to be so amazing when we won. We pulled into the campaign office. I was still trying to process it all, but then we walked in the front door, and people started to clap and cheer. There weren't any tears. I thought, what are you happy about? We lost. But I was the odd man out because I was apparently the only one who thought we were going to win. My dad promptly went in the back. He called Dennis Timbrell. He congratulated him on his victory. It was a cordial conversation. It lasted under a minute. And that was that. My dad came out. He thanked the staff. And from what I remember about the moment is that everyone in the room was jubilant and ecstatic, except my father. The staff were excited because we'd moved the needle. I would subsequently learn that they were celebrating because my dad had taken the Liberal Party from third place to second place, which was a difference of maybe 1,000 votes. We'd made a solid dent in the district's Conservative majority, paving the way for a real victory in the future. My father, on the other hand, was at ease. He had done what he needed to do, and he had a look of satisfaction that he'd done it. Thanks to my father, that was the night I learned that there is a deeper way to think about politics, which for so many people has become a dirty word. Politicians are all crooks, they say. The system is rigged. I don't trust any of them. And it's true that there's no shortage of politicians who provide reasons not to trust politicians. But the world is full of people who engage in politics for the right reasons. I know that because my immediate family is full of people who engage in politics for the right reasons. And on that night in 1981, that dingy old storefront campaign office was full of people celebrating simply because they'd exercised their right to engage in politics for the right reasons. To this day, when I hear people run down politics and politicians, I recoil because cynicism about politics is a luxury of those who have never had to experience life without it. And if those people ever truly lost their ability to participate in the system, they would never take it for granted again.
Wow. But then, a mere 6 years later, your father goes on to win that seat in 1987.
Which almost feels like so much less of an impressive story.
No, but it's so true. It's so true. It's so true. But there were
a much better tale.
But what was interesting about that is that win catalyzed a lot as well.
Yeah.
Like during that period, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I was a teenager. I was, involved in some of these campaigns, and there was a sense that the world was changing.
Yes.
As a result of some of those sorts of wins, and your father was key amongst them. But your mother was an enormous figure in her own right. and played a big role, and certainly could have become and basically gave up the opportunity to be in what would undoubtedly have been a cabinet role in the Chrétien government.
And you know my family. I mean, most people
her.
who know my family, if you in a vacuum, you'd think my mother was the politically involved.
Absolutely.
My father's sort of a quiet, almost bookish fellow. He's going to hear this recording. Sorry, just delete that. My father's a very robust,
lovely
intellectual
man, extraordinary.
But my mom's the glad handler.
Yeah.
Right, she came from a family of 12 siblings, so she's all about crowds and people. So that was catalyzed people, and my mother did pull out of the campaign, also for cultural reasons, because she was a candidate in the 1993 federal elections. But my grandmother, who lived with us, her mother-in-law, the woman who raised me, fell ill. And in our culture,
who's also a fierce lady.
She was a fierce lady. She was a fierce lady, and my mother pulled out of the race to sort of take care of my grandmother in her ailing final days, and I think my grandmother wanted that to be the case. And my grandmother was a very forward-thinking woman also. Neither of my grandmothers had formal education, but they were both very, very forward-thinking women. And so my mother didn't become an elected politician, but she was a candidate. My sister was a candidate. In my family, politics was and remains a noble profession.
Wow. And for that, like, you were involved in politics early on. Like we were both involved in politics.
Campus politics and student politics and
much.
A lot.
So funny story that so Ali, a terrific writer, by the way. One of the reasons to get the book is terrific on the page, and started off as a print journalist.
Wanted to, at least. I mean, I did it in high school and in college, but
and in college, but as a Queen's Journal reporter, got into the 1992 Democratic Convention.
Yes, that's correct.
And it's not in the book. It's not in the book.
I'm going to pull you stuff up. That is really good.
I'm going to pull up stuff.
That's great.
And and so talk about your transition. And I followed the
story. I mean, it was wild.
And it was a good story too.
I was hanging around with no real work to do, and I convinced.
How did you get into the convention?
You get a letter. I had to have some people write me letters to say that I'm actually legitimately who I am, thinking they would just say no, but they gave it to me. And I came here. I came to New York, and I you get a big badge, and you do what you got to do. But I had no real work to do. All the other reporters were actually filing stories on a constant basis. So I went to the area where the AP reporters were working, and they were all awfully busy. And I sort of pitched myself to some guy to say, I'm kind of free, and I've got nothing to do. Would you like a story? And he looked at me like, you got to be kidding. I'm doing a lot of stuff. But his mind worked very quickly, and there was something happening at a nearby hotel where Ross Perot, or the delegation from Arkansas, was meeting Ross Perot in the lobby, and it wasn't certainly going to be any kind of big story that any of you were ever going to read, but he probably felt some responsibility to cover it, and he's thinking, I got this kid here who says he can go, so he gives me the assignment. And I go off to this hotel, I think it was on 57th or 58th Street in New York, and I interview all these people. I come back, I file the story, he edits it, and he puts it on the system. No one ever read that story. No newspaper ever picked it up. But I actually did my first piece of real-world journalism there.
And so tell us about that moment, because I mean, anyone that knew Ali during that period would have said, this is a guy destined for politics. This is somebody who is, I remember we were in Model Parliament together, we were in the House of Commons, doing that stuff and looking around saying, this is, the natural trajectory of things. But of course, as life evolves, many different trajectories emerge. But journalism really called to you during that period.
It really did. And it's not weird that it did, because what did those of us who liked politics or lived in politics consume all the time? We consume the news. So the important people who told you, who guided you, and gave you the information that you required to be an informed member of the electorate upon which democracy depends, were the news people. I grew up thinking these were important people. And so I don't know. It was never really an active decision to not pursue life in politics. Many of our friends did, and are still actively involved to this day, and it's fun to watch. I just decided to go a different way, and it didn't feel all that different. Although let me tell you, telling your never have I thought my parents so Indian as when I told them I wanted to be a journalist. Then all of a sudden it was like, what? What's wrong with lawyer or doctor? So that was the only weird. It was like I was telling them that I was going to become an abstract artist. But that was the move away, and I was subsequently very supportive of the whole operation. But to me, I was still staying largely in the family business.
So let me just read a couple of questions from the audience here, because I'm concerned that we're occupying this with political talk here. But let's go to journalism. And so talk to us. There's a couple of questions here about the nature of journalism and ethics right now. And clearly we are at a juncture point.
Yeah.
And you often talk about the bearing witness quality of journalism and the facts quality of journalism. So tell us where we are in the trajectory of your career. And you've had this amazing career.
Yeah.
That, started off and, you were doing TV in Canada, business journalism in Canada. I mean, my gosh, Oprah had you on during 2008 to explain the financial crisis to folks. So but you made a choice to get out of that business journalism and into other topics that were probably sort of closer to you.
And that was pretty recent. I mean, that was 2016. It became an active choice to me. Although at Al Jazeera, I'd become much more involved in global affairs. The way it worked is I started in business news and then got hired by CNN Financial News, but then CNN Financial News closed down and I joined the main station. But I also then started hosting a CNN International show that was co-hosted out of London and Hong Kong and produced in Hong Kong, which sort of segued me into a little bit of international affairs. And then Al Jazeera hired me. I was still an economics guy, but I was much more an international affairs, global affairs kind of guy. And at CNN, I'd done a lot of higher risk stuff, hurricanes and things like that. So when you morph it all together, I've become this sort of this different person. But then I joined MSNBC, and the reason I did it was right before the election of 2016, literally weeks before the election. I think it was end of October. And the thinking was, the prevailing wisdom at the time was that Hillary Clinton was going to be the president of the United States, and there would be a lot of policy-oriented stuff in that administration. And I had become particularly adept at breaking down and explaining policies. I had read the whole Affordable Care Act, for instance, and dug into it. I like this kind of stuff. So they thought that's what I would do at MSNBC. And I write about the fact that they hired me because there was an anchor slot very, very early in the morning, and it was 5 a.m. or something like that. But I had built that show at CNN for the woman who was now my boss at MSNBC. So she said, "Can you help us fix this show up?" And I said, "Sure." But that meant going to bed very early. So election night, I go home before the polls close, and I take a nice hearty little Ambien and go to sleep. And I write about this in the book, where suddenly my phone rings and it's my boss. And she said, "I need you in the office now." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because markets are tanking, futures are tanking worldwide." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Because Donald Trump is winning." And I said something along the lines of, "This is BS," and I hung up the phone. And she phoned me back and said, "Turn on your TV." So I was a very sleepy guy I in the office an hour later.
So look, I mean, so you are in this new transition into doing not business journalism,
right,
but doing more political journalism.
Yep.
And you're getting around, seeing the world, seeing people in their communities. And when does it strike you? And how does it strike you that you are doing a different type of job, and a job that in other parts relate back more to this idea of understanding citizenship in a different way?
It probably started in that post-2016 era when fundamental issues about our society became clearer to us. But I wouldn't say that was entirely obvious to me. It really struck me literally. It's how I opened the book in Minneapolis on May 30th, 2020, when I was literally struck with a rubber bullet in my leg.
You got shot.
I got shot. And that's when it occurred to me, a few things occurred to me all at once, that my parents had arrived on these shores some 50 years earlier, and that marked the end of their quest for democracy. And I thought we put that in a drawer. That's over. That's a piece of ancient history we don't talk about anymore. And I'm thinking, I seem to be in the middle of some quest for democracy all of a sudden. It wasn't 100% clear to me, but it was starting to gel that something else was going on here. And that I was hit by an armed agent of the state into what was subsequently described as a violent rally. But I was there. One of the reasons I go to these hurricanes and I go to these things is I'm there. And I was able to say that's simply not what happened. That's simply not true. And Donald Trump decided he would campaign on this issue for a little while about that particular night and my getting hit and what was going on. It just wasn't true. His story is much more compelling than mine is, but it wasn't true. And the third thing that occurred to me is that people talk to me, and I'm sure you, about what an interesting job you have. You have a front row to what is unfolding in the world, the front row to history. And I realized there that we're not in the front row, we're in the arena. Once you're getting shot, you're in the arena. You're in it, you're in it. And so are all of you. We are all in this thing. This is an actual fight for the preservation of democracy in which we all exist. Now, I mean, we all have slightly different roles to play in it, but we have to decide to play it. And it's okay for me to be an activist in favor of democracy is okay. It's sort of like being an activist in favor of peace or an activist in favor of a safer climate. That's not a politically partisan thing. It is saying democracy exists because of an informed electorate, and my role is to help that electorate be informed. Hence, I am a tool of democracy. I'm a part of democracy. I exist because of democracy, and democracy hopefully flourishes because of the type of work that I do. And so that connection to citizenship as an obligation as opposed to a series of rights started to become clearer to me. And I was thought of citizenship as the right to vote, the right to do this. Yeah. It's an obligation to uphold democracy.
And you became an American citizen.
I did become an American citizen.
Based around that.
Yeah, and I was sort of ambivalent about the whole thing. I don't think it was I treated it with such a casual approach that I don't think I didn't tell anybody. Nobody even came to the swearing in. I didn't think it was an important matter. There's a selfie of me that I took thinking maybe I should just memorialize this. But I did realize in that citizenship swearing in ceremony, and there are a number of students in the room here, and I had a little conversation with them earlier about this, that I treat some things very casually because of the kind of life I live. So I'm on planes all the time, so I don't, to me it's like taking a bus. And I've started realizing that sometimes I get on a plane and that's somebody's first trip. That's some kid's first trip. I remember my first trip on an airplane, it was life-changing. Or that's somebody going to meet their spouse, or somebody going to see a sick relative, or say goodbye to a sick relative, or somebody's honeymoon. And I needed to start to think about the fact that these things we share all mean different things to all of us. And so I finally, because in the citizenship court room, they take your phone away, which I think is nonsense. So here I am sitting there for it's like 2 hours long. They're filing everybody in. I don't have a phone with me. But they give you a constitution. And I read the Constitution, cover to cover, 3 times in that time. It's nice. It's a good document. And I was never caused to sit and do it. But between reading the Constitution and saying, while we'll live up to all of the things that are written in this thing, it's pretty neat, the things that are written in this. And all of these people and all of the different reasons why they might be in this room with me swearing for their citizenship. Maybe it is to marry someone. Maybe it is because they married someone. Maybe it is to pursue their dreams. Or maybe this marks the end of their escape from some other place. I don't know. But it suddenly struck me that this should be treated more importantly than I've been treating it. And then came the idea that not only should this be treated more importantly, but I have obligations toward citizenship and the upholding of democracy. It doesn't just exist around me, and you can't just sit here in 2024 and say, woe is me, this is looking really bad. You have ways to make the outcome less bad, and we have to engage in them.
So in the 7 minutes that we have with us today, I'm going to ask you 2 questions fundamentally, because this is a bit of a synopsis of some of the comments from the audience. One is the state of journalism, and the second is the state of democracy. And I wonder if you'd say something about democracy here in this country particularly, but also democracy around the world.
Yeah.
And also what your sense of the election is, and we're in the middle of, this is a mega election year around the world.
Yeah.
But particularly the U.S. election is. And so,
let me start backwards. This is the electioniest year I think any of us can remember. More people are going to the polls. More than half the world's voters are going to the polls. Some of those elections are fair. Some of them are not. Some of them are predetermined. Some of them are not. Some of them should be worrisome, including the one in India that's underway right now, because India, Turkey, Hungary are all examples of what we need to worry about, and that is not dictatorship or autocracy being born of revolution, the kind in which you change all the airport names and the main streets and the schools and all that kind of stuff. But this softer thing where you, as voters, because of your frustration with the way certain things are going, hand over certain rights to people who will tell you that they have a better solution or a more obvious solution than the difficult work of democracy. And that's where we are around the world. And the President of the United States likes to say that democracy is growing around the world and autocracy is shrinking. I take exception to that. I don't think he's right. I think it's wishful. I wish he were right, but I don't think he is right. So, we need our democracy in America, and we need to prevent further erosions. When half the country is at risk of losing their reproductive rights, that's actually a problem for the other half, too. Right? This is when you need clarity on that one. Look at South Africa, where 6% of the population voted in apartheid days. Their democracy was fantastic. It was fantastic. For the 6%, they had all the choice in the world. They had different candidates they could choose from. It was neat. It didn't occur to them that the 94% needed democracy too. So for us in America, we have to realize that this is not a women's reproductive rights problem. This is an our rights problem, and we need to step up and deal with that. But so we need our own rights. But the world, and you know this is the beauty of talking to you, as people who are not Americans, the world likes to talk about America. The world likes to talk smack about America. The world likes it when America takes one on the chin every now and then. But they don't want it to fail. They do not want this democratic experiment to fail. It would be very bad, because the influence in the world who would be influenced by negatively influenced by the failure of American democracy, they're ready to pounce. There are a number of bad actors in the world right now who are just waiting to see if they can wait out the Biden administration and try some of their hijinks. There are valid arguments about America not being the policeman to the world, except cars start crashing into each other when America's not there sometimes. There are many people who say America's role in the Middle East has not been as robust as it should have been. It certainly isn't going to get better without America there, believe it or not. So we have to take that seriously. Save your democracy for the sake of saving your democracy, but save your democracy for the sake of saving global democracy. And the role of journalism is complicated in this. I would say this, that cable news has contributed to, and social media has finished the job in erasing complexity from matters that are inherently complex. Right? The thing you and I did growing up is we argued and debated about political ideas that were in front of us at the time. We now live in a world where embracing complexity on an issue is seen as a moral failure. Not being able to immediately have a take on very complicated things that are going on in the world is seen as a moral failure. Not engaging one side or the other only seems like a moral failure. And I would like journalism to help us get away from that. And I am trying in my journalism, in my waning days of my career, to do that, to have us engage with each other respectfully, through empathy, understanding pluralism, and understanding that these matters are all really complicated. If they weren't complicated, we'd have solved them.
Well, television journalism, if you can sort of point the finger at television journalism, clearly you've pointed out this kind of crossfire dynamic, which might have started in, networks that you might have.
I was an intern
work with,
Crossfire, yeah.
And the medium clearly has its own message in this instance.
Yeah.
And its own mode of
operating. And it's got limitations, but actually the old Crossfire wasn't a terrible environment because people were really debating things that they came by honestly. They weren't gaslighting, right? Our danger in media today is that people are lying to you. Yeah. It's not that they have opinions. Everybody's got opinions, and we are not squirrels. We are humans. We can discern people's opinions, and we can say, well, I know where he's coming from on this, but he articulated that very well, and I need to think about that and learn how to debate it. We're going away from that. We're not looking to engage and debate other people. We're just looking for the people with whom we don't have to debate. That is not what is going to create a healthy society. It does create a lot of viewers. It does create a lot of followers on social media. But I would rather do the opposite. I would rather say that if you are operating in good faith and you truly believe what you believe, and we can have a basic agreement that we're on the same side of preserving democracy as the structure within which we exist, then come on and let's have a debate. And I bring those people onto my show. And my viewers don't all love when I do, but I'm not here to protect your sensitivities. I'm here to allow you to understand the breadth of opinion that is out there, and that is our role. That's what we should be doing, allowing the breadth of opinion to be out there and to be debated on every issue. On every issue. Our role and society's role is not to keep people intellectually comfortable. It is not to keep them intellectually safe. And so we need to lean into that in the coming months and the coming days and the coming years to remind people this country was built on some robust discussion, and it needs to continue to move forward on the basis of a robust discussion, not hot takes.
And on that wonderful conclusion, I think that we can bring the proceedings here to a close. But this is, please join me, all of you, in thanking Ali Velshi for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you all.